Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Learning from Adaptations to Coronavirus panel talk at SREcon Americas 2020. I'm your host, Nora Jones. I'm the founder and CEO of Jelly.io, a new incident analysis platform to help you gain the most ROI out of your most expensive investments, your incidents. Today, I'm joined here by Fred Hebert from Postmates, Vanessa Huerta Granda from Enova, and Lorin Hochstein from Netflix. These three have been engineers and program managers in organizations that have scaled greatly during the pandemic and have faced pretty interesting times. Today, I get the opportunity to sit down and talk to them about how they and their organizations have adapted and how they have been able to influence their organizations in these unique ways. I'm so thrilled to get the opportunity to talk to them and learn from them. I've had the pleasure of working with the three of them over the past couple years in the Learning from Incidents.io community on Slack, and I'm looking forward to hearing their experiences today. So I wanted to ask an initial question, and I'll ask it to Vanessa first. What are the biggest changes that you've kind of seen in your organization since the pandemic started, from both like a technical and kind of an organizational perspective, and also with regard to incidents that y'all have seen?
Hey, Nora. So at Enova, we were all pretty much based in Chicago. We did not have a remote policy. Obviously, people, if they were working from home one day, if they were sick, anything like that, that was fine. But overall, everybody was in one single office in Chicago. Specifically for incidents, we had a production incident process that was very much based on everybody is physically in a physical war room. That physical war room has a whiteboard, it has screens, it has all of these things. And so now we've obviously had to move to a remote setup. We rely a lot on Google Meets. We rely a lot on the Google Suite, so Google Docs, Google Meets. If we have an incident, everybody gets online, gets on the Meet, we see your face. So it feels a little bit like, not so much like you're in person, but you still get those visual cues that you would get if you were in person. We also utilize Slack quite a bit. I think in the past, we utilized Slack more, hey, Nora, I'm going to hit you up. Now we see it more as this conversation that is happening about this topic. Everybody's welcome to see it. Everybody's welcome to pay attention to it. Otherwise, a lot of things that have changed have been the kind of glue work that you do, where you listen in on a conversation and you see what's happening. And we've tried to mimic that within Slack. We've tried to mimic that with casual conversations. It is a little bit tougher, but we've managed to adapt so far. And now that we're kind of 7 months into the pandemic, I feel like we're doing pretty good.
Lorin, how about you?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. I switched teams back in February, so like maybe a month before shelter in place. I moved from like the centralized incident management team to the new team that I'm on. And the team that I'm on, it tend to be all, we were in a bullpen. There's a lot of sort of like ambient communication that way. And then once we, sort of first it's like, okay, we're going to go shelter in place. It seemed like it was going to last 2 weeks. Then it kept lasting longer and longer. We rely a lot on sort of Slack style communication. A couple of things that we've done is we basically sort of added more like meeting touch points. So for example, we have like a tactical sync meeting that we started like, once a week, which is sort of like a stand-up-y kind of thing. Like our team didn't do stand-ups before. I introduced like a This Week in Managed Delivery Ops meeting every Friday, where we talk about like what happened in operations this week, just to make sure that everyone sort of is on the same page in terms of operational stuff. Because the team that I'm on, historically, there's an on-call rotation, but it's really more like a supporty on-call rotation. So when something goes wrong with our service, we're like a news service that's spinning up inside the company for deployment. We tend to kind of like swarm on incidents on our team, not so much that like there's an incident commander thing. And so we've historically this team I think has relied a lot on just being around each other to talk, and so we've had to sort of exercise a Slack muscle a lot more to communicate with each other and be explicit about what's going on. And like I have like a shared operational status doc about like, okay, like what do people actually need to care about right now, like what's weird about what we've deployed to production, so that you don't have to keep, because normally you just like sort of ask someone, okay, what's going on here? But now we've had to sort of make it explicit and put it in a doc somewhere and like keep it up to date all the time. So that's one example of something that we've done to adapt.
Was the swarming thing happening when you were all co-located?
So the challenge there is that like the project that I'm on, managed delivery, was just ramping up. So it's like when I got there, it was an alpha, right? And so since shelter in place, it's gone into beta. So the number of customers has gone up. So there weren't really like incidents before, it would kind of break, okay, like it wasn't a big deal. You didn't tell anybody.
Right.
So this team is just like, since I've been there, has had to deal with incidents more, because they are now operating we're now operating a service that people are depending on more than they did when they started. And they've had to ramp up during COVID.
Yeah, that's what I bet. So you've seen the number of internal customers increase, not only as a result of the service rolling out, but as a result of the pandemic and more people using the platform overall.
So I don't know, it's sort of ironic, right? Like I'm work on like a newish kind of automated deployment system. It's a little bit independent of the amount of like traffic that Netflix as a service gets. So like I left that world right before this all happened. So I think in a sense we've been lucky in that it's almost been the reverse a little bit, because people like when the pandemic hit, we entered what like my colleague J. Paul Reed called like safe mode. Right, we're like, we're all distributed now. The load's going up on the service. Like, let's not make as many changes as we normally do. Let's.
Oh wow! So you went to not making as many changes, and then did it get to a point where you were making as many changes as you were pre-pandemic?
Yeah. So then we got to a point where, okay, like this is going to last for a while. This is kind of new normal-ish. We can't just sort of be in a holding pattern. We seem to be okay. We're not like falling over or anything. And so we sort of gradually went back to what I would say is like normal development cadence, and where we're no longer like, we got to be careful.
Got it. What do you know about what time that happened? Like time of the year?
Oh, I don't remember when we switched.
When it started kind of feeling normal again?
Yeah. Or like the new normal, right? Like it's like if you're, if someone's being video recorded all the time, at first they're like really sort of nervous, right? Like, I'm being watched, but like, it's hard to keep that up consistently. Like eventually you just sort of get numb to that. Like right? Like you just get used to it. Like I'm the kind of person I could never work effectively at home, and now you just sort of have to. Like,
you have no other option.
No other choice. Yeah.
Yeah. Fred, what about you? What kind of changes do you think your organization experienced, from back in March to where you are today?
Right. So for Postmates, it's kind of the opposite thing, where we already had remote first culture for a lot of things. From one part of it, it's just that, all the incidents that have to do with food deliveries and peak times are going to be on Friday nights and Saturday nights, and you'd never expect people to be in the office. Everyone is already set up to be remote. The infrastructure team, the platform teams, all these teams already had people all over the world. We had teams in Russia and stuff like that. And so that was already all in place. For us, a lot of the change came from the bigger scale of being suddenly classified as an essential service and the entire part of the industry sizing up, but scaling from different directions we didn't necessarily expect. So anyone who was a gig economy driver suddenly became a food delivery person. And then you had like this side of the business where usually you're short on the supply side, scales up extremely rapidly. Tons of restaurants, tons of businesses who are not even restaurants trying to get onto the platform. And all through that, we were migrating cloud providers. We hit the George Floyd protests, which were really, really quite something to manage from that point of view, because you have to figure out what's a reliable source of information as part of how you handle that part of the crisis. And we got acquired through the entire time through as well in there. So for us, a lot of the changes were not necessarily in the idea of being remote. Lots of people became remote who were not remote before, but we already had all of that in place. Most of it came from like, how do we reorganize with the kind of very, very high demand that happens with that. And we saw it happening quite a few times, I think around April or May, where not just one food delivery company would fall down, all of them would fall down at the same time. And then it became a big scramble through the industry to be the one company still up in a given market to try to gain the share there or something like that. So that was quite special dynamic environment.
I bet there was a lot of interesting things happen. I mean, I know I certainly ordered a bit more food during a period of the pandemic. I was also watching a lot more Netflix too during a certain period of the pandemic. I'm sure y'all had interesting traffic spikes and incidents that, you know, maybe would have really looked weird outside of these months in this year.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I wasn't like in that part of the org anymore, so I didn't see that stuff. But a lot of people were watching. I mean, I remember like Tiger King was like super.
Oh yeah, Tiger
super popular right when the pandemic hit.
Yep.
Streaming and ordering food are the two things that really went up.
Vanessa, did you see your organization's traffic change at all during the pandemic, or could you tell us a little about your organization?
Right. So, you want me to tell you about the organization? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Just like about the,
yes.
Yeah.
So we are, we're an online lending company. So we've got a number of products in different subsets. The one war story that I have to share is we have an on-site call center in Chicago, and it was all in person. And something that I'm pretty proud of is that in March, when the corporate side went remote, our contact center also went remote. When a lot of the call centers in Chicago were actually still requiring people to go into the office, we decided to get them workspaces. We decided to order laptops. And it was quite an interesting, not so much an incident because we knew it was coming, but being there during 4 days, getting 600 people to set up their remote computers. We didn't know what kind of internet connections they would have. We didn't know what kind of computer abilities they even had. For 3 of those days, we had people who were in IT basically doing help desk support. And it was pretty chaotic, but at the end of the day, we solved it, and now they continue to work remotely. And I think it's a huge win for us that we were able to keep people working safely.
Yeah, absolutely. And you manage the resilience engineering team there, right? Have you seen any like resilience engineering tactics or learning from incidents tactics kind of come in handy or escalate during the pandemic too?
So a lot of the interesting thing is that when the pandemic first hit, we actually stopped a lot of the lending that we were doing, and then we've been slowly ramping up. But and it changed per product. So for some of the products, we were making a lot of changes while not having much traffic for many months, and then you're like, okay, let's start ramping up traffic, and then you realize like, hey, what the heck, we've been making a lot of changes and things start to break. And we get to the point where you're having these conversations with engineers trying to ask them, what is it that changed? How do you think this impacts your system? And we were having those conversations, I think, earlier in the summer. And funnily enough, I think we're getting to a point where engineers are more open to the idea of thinking of their systems as resilience systems, right? Like your system can break, it probably will break. Let's think about how you respond to that.
Yeah, definitely. And I imagine like, at least in some of your all's, incident reviews, right after the pandemic started was some of the changes in the all remoteness or the added stress on people's end, or having to teach kids Zoom at the same time as you're doing work. Was that mentioned in any of your incidents as contributors to this? And if so, did you notice that digging into that actually helped you improve and adapt a little bit more to those situations?
So we didn't specifically talk about them during the reviews, but since I own our production incident process, I did, after probably a month of being fully remote, did do a review of how we handle incidents remotely. And I did do interviews with people where we talked about that. Many of the people who are our usual subject matter experts do have children at home who are now staying with them the entire day. So we definitely talked about that, and we made sure to adapt our process to take into consideration just people have other stuff going on in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I imagine, like, if we all do go back into the office, or if some of our organizations partially go back into the office, if we all do go back into the office, or if some of our organizations go back into the office, like, we're probably going to see an uptick in incidents again. We're probably going to see an uptick in a number of other things, because even though we were all in the office at some point, it's, we're used to being at home now. And so it's like another shift. Does anyone's workplace have kind of plans for that yet? Have y'all, as folks sitting near the SRE space, have you all thought about that?
From our point of view, if I recall, the company went remote first when there were about 15 cases in California or something like that. And part of the continuous communications that we had internally is that as long as the rate of people being infected is not lower than when we started, there's no reason to go back. And looking at the current trends, there's no short-term indications that we have to consider going back to the office at this point, if I want to put it in a way that's not very enthusiastic. From my point of view, it's not that big of a deal because I've been working remote for 10 years and I'm pretty comfortable with that. But I know it's a lot harder for people who like the office first interactions in there, and trying to migrate that to the offline workflow has been difficult. And for a lot of people, exactly as you had asked a bit about, the workload of doing it with children at home is way different than just working remotely. It's working remotely in a time of crisis, in a weirded up situation for your family that's not the same as what you expect. And that pressure is entirely different from just regular remote work.
Yeah, one thing I'll say is that so when we go back, and we don't have plans in the like near term, although our offices are open if you want to work there, but it's all social distance, and you can't be in meeting rooms together and stuff. One thing I think will be a little challenging is when we're like hybrid. So right now we're basically everyone is remote, and so everyone is using the same communication channels, right? When you go hybrid and some people are physically co-located and some people are remote, then you have this like communication channel that not everyone can tap into, right? Some people are going to talk to each other, and some people are not going to hear that, and that gets harder for incidents. So you have to have like the, if you have the situation room model where you all go in there and turn it on, and then it's a little bit it's better when you if you get to the point where you do that, and it escalates to the point where you do that. But I can definitely see cases where communication is missed because two people talk to each other, and so sync that way, but someone else who was at home just didn't hear that. We've also seen we've had a couple incidents or operational surprises that have gone on like into the evening, very long, and someone's like, oh, I have to go for dinner, and so like handoffs are a little bit easier when you're all remote, but like if you're in the office and it gets late, that gets harder, right? Because you have to do the commute. We don't have like the commute home problem right now that you do when you're
just like stepping over to the kitchen.
Right? Yeah. So you're always like right there, whereas when you're going to and from work, then there's like a commute barrier you have to worry about.
Mm-hmm. I definitely agree with what Lorin said, especially because I hear so much of when we start going back into the office, some companies may be doing an A team one day, a B team the other day. I remember when there were days when we were still pre-March, everybody would go to the office. Maybe I just was working from home one day and I was calling into a meeting. I probably got like 50% of what was happening, just because we would tend to focus on whoever was in the room. So that mix of between remote and in person, I think that's going to be tougher than like everybody's remote or everybody's in the office.
Yeah, my experience with this is that, as long as you're about 50% remote, most people remember or keep the remote people in mind and carry some information, and you're not losing too much. But the bigger the fraction of people in the offices, the harder it is. And I've been the only remote employee in a 1,000-people company, and it's nearly impossible to get anything done with other people, or you could be missing for 4 days and nobody knows. But there's this kind of ratio or tipping point where people stop remembering or keeping in mind the people who are working remotely, and there's a quick degradation for these people starting then.
Vanessa, I think you may have brought it. Yeah.
I think what we learned from this is that we've gotten creative and we've mostly figured things out. If you had asked me back in March, I was like, I hate all of this. I hate not seeing people. I hate not talking to them. And now that we're 7 months in, I'm like, wow, I finally got a desk that has a light. It's not that terrible.
There's also a big habit shift that comes with it as well, where early in the pandemic, when I was talking with a lot of teams or people at different companies who had not done remote work before, the initial reaction is, let's move office work online. And so you tend to have the same kind of meetings with the same structure and everything. Whereas if you've worked for a company that is remote for the first time around, there is a different way of going about these things. The amount of communication you shift asynchronously or do differently, or don't rely on the same kinds of meetings at the same frequency or something like that, is different. And as you spend more and more time in a remote or distributed over many time zones kind of situation, you adapt and shift the way you organize work differently than just taking the thing online and moving it that way. Kind of similarly as what we're doing with conferences at the same time as well, where the reality of online, if you take it as an online first experience, doesn't have to just be a translation of what we do in face-to-face situations and just dragging it online.
Yeah, I mean, it honestly shouldn't be, right? Like that's, it's a recipe for not great stuff to happen. One of the things that we found when we initially held this panel internally in the learning from incidents community was that many folks found one of the hardest things was to not have those hallway style conversations. And so they were missing out on, I mean, I can't tell you how many times like I walked past the kitchen in previous organizations and like found out about a project that was actually going to impact my work just because I saw someone getting coffee and I talked to them for a second, right? And so Lorin, you had mentioned that you created this like weekly meeting to talk, just about ops things that come up. Do you find that that's helping with some of those hallway conversations that might have happened, when you were co-located?
It's funny. Like I wouldn't put them in the hallway conversation category because to me, I feel like that's more like on other, like interacting with other teams. Where I found it's been really useful is to learn from each other on how to do sort of like the troubleshooting and sense making during an incident, right? So like what I've tried to do with those is have people talk about, okay, like what did you see? Where did you go? So, okay, I saw that graph go up and then I looked in the log and I did this query. And so the challenge is that like typically, we learn from like looking over each other's shoulders, right? Like for someone who's more experienced, and we've lost that now. And, I was like relatively new to this team. And, they haven't been doing as much operations on this project until now since they've been ramping up. And so we've lost that ability to see. And like, especially that work is often invisible, right? Like you just say, okay, but like you have to know, okay, you have to poke the database here, or, you have to make this particular REST. If you make this REST call, then okay, that makes that thing do a recheck. And so trying to make that explicit, right? Trying to have people walk through and talk about, how they solved it. And like, it's been actually, like I've had to remind people because the tendency is to like talk a lot about the bug, right? Oh, the bug was like, that was the bug. And getting people to talk about like how did you figure it out is not something that is sort of like naturally comes in that context, but it's been super helpful for people to get better, I think, at troubleshooting when they're the ones that are swarming.
So it sounds like you've changed and adapted the way that you're training people and like ramping them up to new things. Have y'all seen like I wonder if we saw a graph throughout the pandemic of like, amount of Zoom meetings, like if that would be going up and down organizationally. Like I'm sure at first it was a ton, right? We all had a lot of Zoom fatigue. I'm sure we all still have a lot of it now, but we've also gotten used to, does this need to be a meeting? Should this be a document? I'd love to also see a graph of like the amount of documentation that went up, right? Like, I know my team relies on a lot of documentation internally just to, here's the context on this decision that got made. Are y'all seeing like new types of meetings get created or sustained over the course of this pandemic, or even more documentation, more usage of tools like Slack?
Yeah, from our end, definitely that like meetings. We started off, and once we got past all the craziness of moving to remote and moving our contact center, we were like, okay, let's have stand-ups with our team every day, and then this was with the managers. And after a while, we're like, we don't need that. Half the people can't make them. We already have 3 meetings throughout the day with each other, so we decided we don't need them. Maybe we only meet once a week for that. I think we've realized that a lot of our meetings can just be asynchronous documents that people collaborate on, particularly if I know, like, hey, my one coworker needs to pick up their kids at noon, and that's when I'm free, and this other person needs to do Zoom school at that time, and then there's 5 other meetings to attend. Maybe we don't need to have another meeting. Maybe we just create a document that we all agree to look at whenever we have time, and collaborate on that. And the meetings that have stuck are the ones that people are very careful about the agenda, make sure that things are moving along. And that's something that I've loved to see. I think a lot of people hate meetings because they hate bad meetings. But when people are thoughtful about what we want to accomplish, and we're thoughtful that this is people's times and we want to make sure that we're using it correctly, we're seeing a lot of great things.
Yeah, absolutely. Lorin, you brought up a point earlier that I thought was interesting. You said the hallway conversations tend to help different teams get aligned. I'm wondering, like, due to the lack of hallway conversations, if any of y'all saw incidents arrive where there were more than one team involved, that there was kind of a miscommunication between teams that maybe would have been a lot easier, from a co-located standpoint, and there was a learning afterwards on how to communicate better in this kind of new world. Did anyone see new incidents arise between teams that didn't typically have incidents between each other? Anything like that y'all can think of?
I can tell you from, sorry.
Sure, go ahead.
I can tell you from our end, when we've had a few incidents when it comes to, we're starting to ramp up volume, maybe we don't have the capacity for it, or, we weren't expecting these like hot, cold restarts or whatever. And so, yeah, some of the findings have been just talk to each other. If you're going to be ramping up volume in one state for one product, like maybe think about who needs to be aware of that.
So, I mean, we've had some situations where there's been an interaction effect. So, one service will change like a default value, and so the response payload is now changed, and they didn't think that would affect that. Like, they didn't think we were consuming it. Or another team was doing like testing, and they didn't realize that they were generating events that affected someone else. I actually don't know if hallway conversations would have even caught these things. To be honest with you, like, you'll get maybe some serendipity, but like the truth is that like there's just so many different like couplings that you don't see. And there was a case where so I'm in an delivery org, and all the apps are called Spinnaker, or the name of the overall system is Spinnaker. And there was a change in Spinnaker, and they emailed us out, and they said, hey, this might change. And like I saw that email, and I did not process it in my head, like they like, action, they had the action, action needed. And I looked at that email, like my eyes went through it, but I didn't process it. And then like something broke on ours, because of that interaction. And I remember some of my team saying, hey, they should have socialized that. And well, they did, at least they thought they did. Would it have been, probably, if we were, I mean, it's hard to imagine the counterfactual, but given that like we actually sit next to those folks since we're in the same org, there's probably a good chance that would have come up, about like, that. I think honestly, a lot of the hallway conversations are like, oh, you're working on this thing X, like we're working on something similar, something related, like making those kinds of like kind of positive connections, rather than so much like, oh, you're going to make that change. Hey, that's going to, that may end up breaking me.
That's a good point. It more so kind of escalates each other. Are you seeing, I mean, especially in some of the larger organizations y'all are in, are you seeing some of that redundancy occur where folks are almost working on some of the same things without even realizing it, more so than before?
I mean, I don't know about more so. We always have a certain amount of, we're big enough that like, there's always some efforts that seem like they're overlapping in some way. They try to corral them and get everyone moving in the same direction.
Mm-hmm.
I get a feeling that we're seeing a bit less of it because a lot of the communication is a lot easier to broadcast and less done person to person or in these informal conversations, and a lot of them go through more official channels or mailing lists or something like that when someone can look at them. And it feels like there's always a few key people in many of the teams that know what other teams are going. And it seems that the information goes through that graph a bit faster than it did before. And we have a few more opportunities to catch that stuff than we did. That could also be a consequence of some of the reorganizations that we did and a lot of rapid work and shifting to manage the scaling that we had to do. Some of the things that came out of that stayed after and probably had an impact there where there was a good bit of cross-pollination across teams. And if these relationships stay around, at least the information is a bit easier to shift around the organization when that happens.
Makes sense. With regards to your incidents and your coordination around incidents, given that, you can't all hop into a room together, do you still see like folks kind of hop into Slack or Microsoft Teams or other channels you're using and conduct the incident primarily there, or are you more so on a Zoom or a Google Hangout, or is it a combination of both?
In our case specifically, I mean, we're able to fit 50 to 60 people in a Zoom meeting without a problem. They're just not all talking. A lot of them are observing or doing part of the communication in back channels and Slack at the same time. But the pattern that was there, and because everything was always remote, was that someone becomes a kind of de facto incident manager or leader because they have the technical ownership of that part of the system. And a few key people from around the teams or different contacts that they have, since the company is still pretty small. It's still very much person-based, I would say. But it's very common to see incidents where you have from 3 to 10 people working on the incidents, but you could have like 40, 50 bystanders just looking at what is going on at that point. And one of the things that made a few incident investigations easier was just switching from one software to another one that lets you record the sessions. And then we had the trace of everything, but everything was already taking place online for the most part. It's harder to see all the back channels communications. They do take place. They're important because people are mindful of not speaking over what is already going on in the session. But it self-organizes pretty easily at that point.
Do you think you're getting more bystanders and observers now that like all the incidents are kind of online rather than in a room? I mean, sometimes you're walk into
yes and no. I mean, when we were in
right?
March and April, essentially everything was more or less on the brink of being on fire all the time because of the scaling that happened. And for that period of time, it was like one long ongoing incident, like fire season or something like that. You don't fill in reports, you don't study everything. Everyone is kind of getting aware of what broke last night, and then you have 2 or 3 days to fix it before it spikes again, or before you get Cinco de Mayo, and then people order a lot of tacos or something like that. And it's just, it became a kind of all hands on deck situation. The team I'm on, our components were way overscaled and way over provisioned. And we essentially exploded our team to go on loaner to a bunch of different teams to help them because they had more pressing needs and everything like that. And it was that interesting alignment where usually there's this pressure or negotiation that you need to have between the engineering concerns and the product concerns and shipping fast. But when everyone in the industry is going down at the same time and you have the opportunity to gain the most market share by just being up, for a few weeks or even a few months, we had that great alignment where product was just like hands off and going, yeah, do what you have to do. That's better than anything we could do in terms of growing the product. And that was a super interesting time to be in the company.
That's amazing. Lorin or Vanessa, did you all see anything like that, I guess, towards the beginning of the pandemic? I know, Lorin, you said you left the traffic side, but still, like, even on the delivery side, you're having to support the traffic, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, I could tell you a little story on it from our team. Our service got into a bad state at one point. And So on delivery, there's actually like a central like delivery, like an on-call channel for like the, where the people who talk about like the critical like sort of delivery services hang out. And so my team has their own channel, and something went wrong, and our service sort of went sideways, and I started slacking, and then someone else on my team was like, just sort of pinged me on the side and said, hey, you should probably say this in like the on-call channel, right? And so I moved to the on-call channel, and there's a lot more bystanders there. And so one of the bystanders, someone on another team, was like suggested like the database, right? Because like everything was fine in our staging environment, and then it sort of blew up in prod. And someone suggested, well, hey, maybe like something got poisoned in the database. Maybe you should poke at it. And it turned out that was the problem in that case. And so it was helpful to us to sort of handle that particular incident in like a more public channel, even though like our service is not as critical as the other ones, just like moving it in there, having that discussion meant that people who had more operational experience, even though they didn't know our particular service, were like, oh, that smells like a database problem. Like,
Yeah.
maybe you should delete a record, record in the database.
Are you seeing the same thing as Fred, like more bystanders or observers during some of your incidents? Are you all mostly still doing it in Slack? Or are you jumping on video calls too?
We're almost like, my team is almost entirely doing it in Slack. If we really need the additional communication bandwidth, we'll jump into like a Hangout or a Zoom, like a video chat. But it's pretty rare that we do that. It's not very common for us to have to do it like that. Only if we're really stuck, and we don't we're really having trouble figuring out like what to do next. So far we've mostly gotten by with Slack, and that tends to be like our go-to communication channel.
What about you, Vanessa?
We do a hybrid of video, Google Meets, and then on Slack. So we usually, I can tell you, we had an example today where I'm on call this week actually for Incident Commander. We had an incident. We went on the Google Meet. As we talk on the Google Meet, I like to type what we're finding on Slack. We have one Slack room that's for all of our production incidents, so that people can just go and look. People like being onlookers. People like seeing what's going on. And as I was typing, I had one of our principal engineers for something else being like, "Hey, I don't think that this is what you're looking at." And I'm like, "Why don't you get on the Meet and talk to us about it then?" And a little bit of pressure there, and he did, and it was really, really helpful. So that's just one example where I think it works for us to see face to face, to collaborate that way, something like this on a Zoom. But it's good to have the information on Slack so other people can see it and chime in.
That's interesting. I'm in a much smaller organization, and so we all are still small enough that we all keep in contact with each other, on the daily. But I imagine if I was in a larger organization, I would, and I'm probably a special case here, but I would be wanting to attend more incident reviews just as a means of learning what's going on at other places in the organization. Are you all, as people in your organizations that advocate for good incident reviews, are you all socializing that? Like, hey, this is a way to keep up with context on our systems. Are you seeing people voluntarily come to more of these?
I'll chime in. It was, in 2019, it was my personal goal to start having our incident retrospectives on the tech-wide calendar so that everybody could attend. I had dreams of putting it in getting the largest conference room and having everybody attend. And I kind of gave up on that dream, but it's still there. I think we have the usual suspects, right? Like the principal engineers are really excited to attend these meetings. People from certain teams that their products touch a lot of things. They're always interested. So yeah, I have seen an uptick. I still wanna make sure that we're getting to all of the engineers. So the person who's just joining and who doesn't know what's going on, who doesn't know that we even have production incidents. And that's been a little hard. I personally kind of thrive in an in-person environment where I would just be in the kitchen and find someone and talk to them about it. And that's just been harder for us here. So I'm still hoping to do that. North Star for 2021, but we'll see.
Fred or Lorin, what about you? I mean, I think that might be an effort that would probably have to be socialized. Like that might not pop into everyone's head like, whoa, I could go here to gain a lot of context on like what's been happening organizationally recently. Um, are you seeing folks either come to that conclusion on their own, or are you either of y'all kind of socializing that a little bit more internally?
So for me, that was also one of my objectives for 2020 of trying to improve the incidents that we had. Postmates had a fun one where our SRE team more or less disintegrated before COVID, and we ended up having no SREs left, needing to build it from scratch. And I became a kind of
Wow.
owner facilitator from other teams. Just like if we had a tricky incident, I tried to help with that, and it went sort of well, but we quickly hit the limits of I'm the one who's really passionate about that, and so I'm just given harder and harder incidents, but the rest of them are not necessarily getting a better treatment and everything. In the meanwhile, we've got more SRE folks coming back in, switching with different tooling and everything like that. But I'm still trying to, switch us away from the mode of the data dump with action items to having the actual analysis and everything in there. And for that matter, I think I'm focusing more on the actual reports after the fact rather than a big meeting review, because it's really, really hard to get people in that many time zones in one room at the same time to review an incident.
Do you find that people are reading those reports? Like, have you changed your kind of dissemination strategy there?
I mean, we do it over Google Docs, and so I'm getting statistics, and I see that they do have people reading them. And the pattern that we see is the kind of same one as we see in architectural proposal documents that we send around, which is some people get known for writing good reports or good reviews or good proposals, and so these people get a lot of eyes and others don't, and there's this kind of informal recommendation network. So if you should go read that one, it's interesting, or something like that. But it's not a systematic thing yet of all the incidents are properly reviewed and all the reviews are properly read or something like that. A lot of it is still, I would say, personality based.
Makes sense. Lorin, are you seeing some changes around, who attends these reviews? Are people using this internally as a way to get context, or even your Friday meeting as a way to get context?
Yeah, it's hard for me to tell with the larger IRs, like the bigger ones, if there's more people attending or not. I don't feel from my point of view like they've been socialized differently than in the past. So it's sort of hard to tell. In my corner of the world, I've been trying to do oops write-ups when things happen on my team. So we have that. So we if something sort of big happens, we'll end up using that weekly operations meeting mostly, like basically as an IR meeting. And I've been trying to do write-ups like by example to keep that going and to encourage other people to do it. I don't get to do it all the time. Like it's hard because I can't do it in less than 2 weeks. And these are like relatively small things, and so I have to just make peace with the fact that I'm not going to get any other work done in 2 weeks. But my team has been very supportive and people like it. And I've gotten feedback like from people who were in the incident, like that they were like excited reading they were anxious reading the write-up, even though they knew what was going to happen because they were directly involved. And what I've been trying to do also, like, so some other people at Netflix besides me write these like oops operational surprise write-ups, and I've been trying to encourage that a little bit more again. So like there's an oopsies channel in our Slack, and I haven't posted in a while, but the other day like someone on another team wrote up an interesting oops. I even tweeted about it where they one of the contributors was like testing. So testing made the problem worse, and like an unbounded queue saved them. And typically, I would say like unbounded queues are bad, you shouldn't do them, and testing is good. But like that got it, I put in the Slack that, that go check out the soups write-up. And so I am hoping that, these things are hard. Like even, me as a champion, I can't do them as much as I would like to. But I think I've been pleasantly surprised that like people around me have seen the value of them and like to read them and support someone spending the time to do them, even if they don't themselves want to be the one to step up and do those write-ups.
Do you also have a kind of ops review panel or board or meeting for people of different teams to keep in sync, or that's something entirely different from that?
No, so the weekly meeting, ops meeting we have, like we invite other, so like our sister teams are invited to that. And at first, like a bunch of people would come, and then it sort of trickled out, and they, I guess, unless it was an interaction with their own service, they tended to be less interested in what was going on in ours. So, it's open to people, but I think unless they really feel like there's like a direct personal interest in attending, then they've not been getting a ton out of coming, and so it's sort of fallen off.
Makes sense. Yeah, I was at an organization previously that I think, that clicked with some people. It's like, whoa, even though, I'm a front-end engineer, if I go to this search infrastructure meeting that seemingly has nothing to do with me, I now understand kind of how search works. And like all of a sudden, sort of the entire organization levels up a little bit more in a way that they didn't realize before. I feel like that's a light bulb that goes off in a lot of people's minds when, they attend a good amount of post-incident reviews, which is probably why, Vanessa, that you have a lot of principal engineers at yours, because they realize, wow, this actually really makes me a better engineer, right? Like I'm going to keep attending these because now I have all this knowledge of the system and who to contact and like how certain things work. So, I mean, we've been in the pandemic in like this, not a lockdown, but like this new operating mode as the software industry for several months now. Do you all think there are innovations that can happen either organizationally or outside the organization that the software engineering or the software industry could really take on or learn from other industries right now that would help us with this, especially as software is, I mean, we all knew software was critical before, but now it's like way more critical than ever. Are there things that you all, as experts in this space, think that we all could be doing differently or thinking differently about?
I think a basic one that was highlighted is probably how there is little equity in how people have access to high technology, good connectivity, and homework environments for these kinds of things. And there's this idea that innovations or the future is here, it's not spread evenly, is something like that. The feeling I've got is that the next big step of innovation is not necessarily in bringing new technology, it's in spreading it to more people and making it available to everyone and seeing what happens in there. A lot of the big results and surprising things that happen come from network effects, not necessarily just putting the new tech out there. And what we're seeing with everyone shifting to more virtual workspaces and something like that, I think will come from consequences of this being spread out to everyone more than any piece of technology we would personally be writing.
I love that. Vanessa, Lorin, what about y'all?
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of struggle with this question. I really liked Fred's comment earlier about how remote work is not, to do remote work effectively does not just mean taking in-person stuff and lifting it online, right? I remember reading that like when radio first came out, they would just like read plays, over the radio, and like that was not the right, most effective way to use that medium. You have to sort of learn it, right? And I suspect, you asked us about what we can learn from other industries. I don't really know other industries because I'm in the software world. But our industry has probably been one of the ones that has been doing remote stuff the longest, because we are like the ones who can embrace technology. And so I think the most effective thing we could do is leverage the companies that have already been remote for a long time. And learn how to like avoid like the lift and shift kind of approach to doing remote. And I'm not a good person to ask because I work for a company that has been co-located for its history. But I am interested in learning about like how do companies that have always been like virtual or online only, what do they do differently, right? So that we don't have to learn all this stuff from scratch again.
Yeah. I think being humble enough to know that, you're not going to solve all the problems. You don't have to be the hero. Maybe somebody else has the answer there. I think also just something that worked in March may not work today, that doesn't mean that it wasn't right in March. It worked back then. It worked great. Now we're somewhere else. And so what I can tell you that works for me right now may not work in January, February, March, and that's fine. I'm not going to take offense at that.
Yep. Yeah, that's a really good point, Vanessa. And like Lorin, to your point earlier too, it's like, yeah, we are all remote, and there are companies that have been doing that forever, but it's, with also the rest of the world now remote too, that I'm sure that's changed things on their end too. And even, adding homeschooling into the mix and all other kinds of stuff. But yeah, there's certainly a lot to be learned and shared here. But so we're about at time now. So I wanted to thank you all so much for participating in this panel.